I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in intellectual history, especially the great classics. From each I've selected an excerpt, 40 minutes or so, no more than an hour. Our purpose is to do a close reading of an important work with the accompanying text. In this episode, we're turning to Immanuel Kant and his 1787 second edition of The Critique of Pure Reason, arguably the most foundationally influential work in modern philosophy. Let's go to the text. First edition of Critique of Pure Reason came out in 1781, and then 6 years later Kant issued the second edition and took the opportunity in the preface to the second edition, to present an overview of his argument, his conclusions, and stressing its main points. So in this episode, we're going to work our way through the second preface to the Critique of Pure Reason. It starts out by saying that reason and its application in the area of metaphysics has been problematic, to put it gently and diplomatically. The problem is actually much worse. So, whether the treatment of such knowledge as lies within the province of reason does or does not follow the secure path of a science is easily to be determined from its outcome. For if, after elaborate preparations, frequently renewed, it is brought to a stop, immediately it nears its goal, it is often compelled to retrace its step and to strike into some new line of approach, or again, if the various participants are unable to agree in any common plan of procedure, then we may rest assured that it is very far from having entered upon the secure path of a science, and is indeed a merely random groping. And that is the status of metaphysics. Up until Kant, the argument is going to be metaphysics has been random groping. It's an attempted application of reason, but it's very far from being a science. And he does, as a contrast, the discipline of logic, where things are completely different. That logic has already, from the earliest times, proceeded upon this sure path, is evidenced by the fact that since Aristotle, it has not required to retrace a single step. Now, why has logic been so successful while metaphysics has been such a dismal failure? Well, that logic should have been thus successful is an advantage which it owes entirely to its limitations, whereby it is justified in abstracting, indeed it is under obligation to do so, from all objects of knowledge and their differences, leaving the understanding nothing to deal with save itself and its form. Now, that then might be a clue, limiting and abstracting. But for reason, though, to enter on the sure path of science is, of course, much more difficult, since it has to deal with not itself alone, but also with objects. So, can we sort out the territory here? In both part, that part in which reason determines its object completely a priori, namely the pure part. So the point here is, can we then isolate the aspect of the process in which reason is determining its object completely purely, and by which we mean no empirical or other source of content admixture into the process. However much or little this part may contain, must be first and separately dealt with. Now again, a contrast. We've contrasted metaphysics to logic now. Let's contrast metaphysics to mathematics and physics and determine how they have been able to make the success that they have been able to make success. Mathematics and physics, the two sciences in which reason yields theoretical knowledge, have to determine their objects a priori, the former doing so quite purely, the latter having to reckon at least partially with sources of knowledge other than reason. And we can go back in history, the point is, and see before mathematics did its revolutionary abstracting. It was just a bunch of random groping around. The same thing is true of physics prior to its entering onto the sure path of a science, a lot of random groping around. But in both cases, there was a revolution, and we can trace the revolution back to certain key figures. So notice in this next paragraph in the discussion of mathematics, right, a revolution occurred. There was an intellectual revolution occurred, and what that involved was, this section here, to bring out what was necessarily implied in the concepts that he himself had formed a priori. That's what the mathematician does in order to put mathematics on the secure foundation of a science. Right? What is implied in the concepts that he himself formed a priori? That is to say, independently of any empirical or sort of objective reality, if we can put those in quotes right now, input, what has been determined by the concepts a priori, and that had put into the figure in the construction by which he presented it to himself. What did we put into the construct? What did we put into the concepts a priori? And once that has done, then mathematics can enter into its revolution. Now, turning to physics, he highlights Bacon, he highlights Galileo, two giants in early science and early philosophy of science. And then he makes a claim that their revolution, the revolution in physics in this case, followed the similar pattern. What did they learn? Well, they learned that reason has insight only into that which it produces after a plan of its own. Now notice that is an important formulation. It's not that reason simply follows along nature or that some sort of external objective reality guides us to where it wants us to go. Rather, reason, our faculty, we, the subject doing this, we produce a plan, and we have insight only into the plan after we have produced it. It must not allow itself to be kept, as it were, in nature's leading strings, but must itself show the way with principles of judgment based upon fixed laws, constraining nature to give answer to questions of reason's own determining. So it's not that we follow nature and it provides the answers. Rather, we provide the plan, we interrogate nature, and we get answers from nature that we have thus extracted according to our plan. And again, that language of revolution setting up for what Kant hopes will be his own philosophical revolution. Still talking about physics here, it must adopt as its guide in so seeking that which itself has put into nature. So reason puts into nature certain things, and then on the basis of that, we can acquire something that we can call knowledge. All right, and this is an important then distinction between on Kantian formulation, previous the random groping stage where we try to be more passive and let nature speak to us, so to speak. Rather, we have to interrogate nature according to our own plan. We are in the driver's seat, not nature in the driver's seat. Now we come back to metaphysics, right? What is metaphysics? And notice the number of adjectives here. It's a completely isolated, speculative science of reason. So it's a project of reason. It's a scientific project of reason. And so when we've learned what the logicians, the mathematicians, and the physicists have done, putting their disciplines on the path of science, that's what metaphysics needs to at least try to aspire to. But then it is a speculative science. That is to say, it's not an empirical science. It's not an experimental science. It's not an observational science. It is a speculative science. It is isolated. Okay, that is to say, it is isolated from any sort of external objective input or reality dictating to it. And the isolated then gets its own adjective. It is completely isolated, cut off, speculative science of reason itself, which soars far above the teachings of experience and in which reason is indeed meant to be its own pupil. So reason turns in on itself. Reason instructs itself rather than reason being instructed by some sort of other source. All right, metaphysics rests on concepts alone. Okay, that is to say, it does not rest on experience, it doesn't rest on observation, it doesn't rest on sensory input. All of those formulations of the empiricists and other closely related forms of doing philosophy prior to Kant, those are going to be wrong. So in this sense, Kant is closer to the rationalists who want to say that concepts can be studied on their own, and on the basis of that we can go ahead and do the right kind of philosophy. And then we return to the struggles that metaphysics has had with all the different methodologies and attempts that have gone on. For in it, that is to say, in metaphysics, reason is perpetually being brought to a stand. Metaphysics has been repeatedly reaching dead ends, and in his own generation, rather, Kant is arguing that it has reached a dead end. Ever and again, we have to retrace our steps. Metaphysics is just this battleground. Metaphysics has hitherto been a merely random groping. Okay, now, what then is the reason why in this field the sure road to science has not been found, or hitherto been found? It has been in logic, it has been in math, it has been in physics. So why is metaphysics a big exception? Why has it not, and there's that word again, excuse me, achieved its revolution? And here, in my judgment, is the most important passage in the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant is signaling what his revolution is going to consist in. So let's pay careful attention and go slowly in this section. Hitherto, that is to say, up until now, what has been the assumption of philosophy? Hitherto, it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. Okay, let's pause there. That then is to say, the assumption of philosophy up till now has been a kind of objectivity as the goal, or small o objectivism. The idea here being that knowledge of the subject is going on inside our own minds. It must conform to something outside of itself, to objects. And so objective reality sets the terms, and the subject, if the subject is to have knowledge, has to conform then to the object. And so that assumption has been objectivity or objectivism. But, Kant goes on to argue, all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concepts have on this assumption ended in failure. We've been doing philosophy for centuries. We've been doing it for millennia. And on this assumption of objectivity, every attempt has failed. Objectivity is a failure. So, we must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. So that then is a reversal. What if we then switch things around? And this is the revolution language. What we then say is, first and foremost comes along is our knowledge, which sets the terms, and objects have to conform to our knowledge. That is to say, what we call the object is conforming to the subject, or the subject rather, which is setting the terms and the conditions of knowledge. And that language then is a rejection of objectivism in the direction of a kind of subjectivism, or the rejection of objectivity in the traditional sense for a kind of deep subjectivity. We should therefore be proceeding precisely along the lines of Copernicus's primary hypothesis, and hence the what is sometimes called the Copernican revolution in philosophy as inaugurated by Kant. And as a reminder, Copernicus's hypothesis was to say we've been doing astronomy on the basis of the assumption that the Earth is at the center of the system and that all of the planets and the stars and the moon and the sun rotate around us as the center. And then we have tried various things to make our models of the heavens work, and it's just failure after failure after failure. We can't make it work. So what if we then switch and say the sun is at the center and we are merely a satellite of the sun? Then we get a lot closer to the truth. And so Kant is then suggesting that the Copernican revolution in philosophy will be on the same order of magnitude. We reject the assumption of objectivity, that our thinking, our knowledge, what we take to be truth has to conform to independent objects. Rather, we want to say that what we take to be the object of knowledge has to be conform rather to conditions set by the knowing subject. All right, so this Kant returns to and gives a number of formulations of it in various aspects of what we take to be knowledge. So, a similar experiment, that is to say to the Copernican experiment, can be tried in metaphysics as regards the intuition of objects. So when we say we are intuiting various things, now that's a term that has a lot of meanings over the course of the history of philosophy, but just take it, in this case, more neutrally as just taking in certain things or things as they seem to be appearing to us and as we are experiencing. If intuition must conform to the constitution of the objects, then I don't see how we can know anything of the latter, that is to say, the objects a priori. So that is to say, if our experience or our intuition has to conform to the nature of objects, then Kant says this seems like knowledge is going to be impossible. But if we change our assumption, if the object as object of the senses, that is to say, the objects that we sense around us, must conform to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, then I have no difficulty in conceiving such a possibility. So we take all of the objects of the senses that are around us right now. If we wanted to say that what they are or how they are and how we are experienced is dependent upon our faculties, our subjective faculties of intuition, then we have the possibility of constructing some sort of knowledge system that makes some sense. All right, so let's try another formulation here where he takes the same language. And we have a dilemma here that we must face. Either I must assume that the concepts by means of which I obtain this determination conform to the objects. And now we're not talking about experiences and intuitions and so on. Let's take our concepts. Where do our concepts come from? If we then assume that the concepts, either we have to assume that concepts conform to the object. So we get our concepts from objects, say, that are out there in reality, or else I assume that the objects, or what is the same thing, that the experience in which alone as given objects they can be known, conform to the concepts. And that's the option that Kant is going to say. First come the concepts in the knowing subject, and objects conform to the subject. In the former case, I'm again at the same perplexity, how I can know anything a priori with regard to objects. So if we say concepts are based on objects, objects come first and objectivity comes first, then we are lost. In the latter case, the outlook is more hopeful. So down a few lines, as regards objects which are thought solely through reason and as indeed necessary, and then long sentence there, we can know a priori of things only what we ourselves put into them. So we, the knowing subject, put into objects certain things. We constitute them, construct them, make them. That's what we can know. All right, so first big conclusion then. We are brought to the conclusion that we can never transcend the limits of possible experience. Though that is precisely what this science, that is to say metaphysics, is concerned above all else to conceive. So we can know experiential objects, but we can't know anything beyond those experienced objects, and now we are operating on the assumption that those experienced objects are conforming to the faculty of the knowing subject, that they don't have a constitution that is in any sense objective or independent of our knowing subject. All right, knowledge of reason, right? That such knowledge has to do only with appearances and must leave the thing in itself as indeed real per se, but as not known by us. So the way things really are, whatever objects are out there, or even if they are objects, nature in itself, reality in itself, things in themselves, not known to us. All that we can know is appearances, and that's going to be the limitation of our knowledge. And then we have another formulation of the same cruel dilemma, and Kant resolving it in the direction of the subjective side of the process. All right, the attempt to alter the procedure which has hitherto prevailed in metaphysics by completely revolutionizing it in accordance with the example set by the geometers and physicists forms indeed the main purpose of this critique of pure speculative reason. All right, so that's the Copernican revolution, and it's a rejection of the assumption of objectivity in the direction of saying that the knowing subject constitutes the world of experience, the world of appearances, and that is all that can be known. Okay, so the value question. What's the point of all of this? What can we get out of this? What is the value of the metaphysics that is alleged to be thus purified by criticism and established once and for all? And then Kant goes on to argue that there is a negative value and a positive value. And he goes on to say it seems like the negative is strongly dominant, and there's not any positive that's left over. Kant is in effect seemingly saying that all we know are subjectively constituted experiences, appearances, and we have no knowledge of things in themselves with the way reality really is independently of us. That negative conclusion seems to be quite strong and powerful and potentially devastating. But Kant does want to argue that there is a positive value here, and this is an analogy he gives to the police down below, where he says, the police place limits to what people can do, and while the police are largely negative, saying no, 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 don't do this, this is off limits, don't go there, the positive value is that once people know what those limits are, then they are safe and secure within those limits, and they can operate in a more comfortable fashion, knowing what they are about. All right, and that's going to be the positive characterization of the value. Now, it gets down to more specifics here. So then we say, well, what about space and time, for example? And this is, of course, one of the big traditional issues in the sciences and in philosophy and then the philosophy of science. What's the nature of space and time? Are space and time real, or are they just subjective creations? Are they absolute? Are they revolutionary? Are they infinite? Are they finite? And so on. So Kant jumps in on this one with the implication of his philosophical revolution for our understanding of space and time. That space and time are only forms of sensible intuition, and so only conditions of the existence of things as appearances, semicolon. All right, so let's pause right there and unpack, because that is quite deep and quite important. Now, of course, there is a traditional debate over space and time, and one side of the debate wants to say that space and time are real phenomena, or they are real or fundamental features of reality as it is in itself. And then there's debates among the objectivist understandings of the nature of space and time. Some want to argue that space and time are these absolute fundamental features of the universe, and then objects and events occur in kind of the space-time container that is fundamental to the universe. Others want to say that the order goes the other way, that objects and what objects are doing, or their actions and or their behaviors, are more fundamental, and that space and time then are ways of relating objects doing whatever it is and that objects do out there in reality. So the objects are more fundamental, and space and time is a follow-up to whatever it is that objects are doing. Now, what Kant is doing is rejecting both of those positions and then saying space and time are not in any way out there in reality independently of us. They are only forms of sensible intuition. That is to say, they are, by the knowing subject, us, or the experiencing subject, conditions that we impose on whatever is coming in through our sensory organs, conditions of existence. So those objects that we come to know, or by means of the appearances or the experiences that we have of those objects, those are conditions that we put on the objects or put into the objects, or that we structure those apparent objects in terms of. So we are adding space and time rather than discovering or finding space and time out there in reality. Moreover, we have no concepts of understanding and consequently no elements for the knowledge of things, save insofar as intuition can be given corresponding to these concepts, and that we can therefore have no knowledge of any object as a thing in itself. So what things are, even if they are objects out there, things in themselves independently of us, we can have no knowledge whatsoever of them. But only insofar as it is an object of sensible intuition, that is an appearance. All we know is appearances, not reality. Thus, it does indeed follow that all possible speculative knowledge of reason is limited to mere objects of experience. All right, that's a strong conclusion. But our further contention must also be duly borne in mind, namely, that though we cannot know these objects as things in themselves, we must yet be in a position at least to think them as things in themselves. So somehow subjectively, even though we don't know these objects, the subject can imagine them, or at least conceptualize formulations about them in some way. Okay, and that's going to be a legitimate option for our reason to pursue, but we must not make the claim that in doing so we are knowing any sort of objective reality. Otherwise, as it would be put, we should be landed in the absurd conclusion that there can be appearances without anything that appears. So there's got to be some sort of independent reality out there providing some sort of raw material for the appearances, but it has to be filtered or structured or construed or constituted by these subjective forms of intuition, subjective conceptual assumptions, and that the object then is going to appear to us, and that is something that we know exists, and there has to be something behind it, but we can't say what that is. So necessarily we have to then make this distinction between objects of experience and those same things as objects in themselves. We haven't made that distinction yet, but we need to explore that now. So what about the traditional things then we're going on to say that we want to say as out there in reality, even though we don't necessarily have a direct experience of it? Suppose we want to say, about cause and effect and whether it is absolute and eternal and real, the existence of God, the existence of the free will and the soul, or the existence of an immortal soul, right? For example. And notice then what Kant does as we start to march through with this distinction between things in themselves and things as they appear to us. We'll have to look at them each from that twofold perspective. One knowledge perspective, one at least thinkable perspective. The principle of causality, okay, that is to say that things are cause and effect, therefore applies only to things taken in the former sense, namely insofar as they are objects of experience. So cause and effect exists in objects of experience, in the apparent world, because we have put causality into the world of appearance. But what about things outside of the realm of appearances? Are they still subject to cause and effect? But these same objects taken in the other sense are not subject to the principle. So we cannot say whether out there in reality, independently of us, things are subject to cause and effect. Then there's no contradiction between our intuitions or our felt hope that in some sense things are cause and effect, but in other senses not. And so maybe the world is driven entirely by cause and effect, and maybe it seems like we have free will. How can we apply this contradiction well, or resolve this apparent contradiction, the thing that we've been arguing about forever, if we then take whatever it is that we are talking about in this twofold sense, talking about it as an appearance and talking about it as a thing in itself. So I cannot know, yet I can think freedom. And this is important because another part of our traditional philosophical debates has been whether morality is possible. And if we presume a kind of strict causality, that seems to give rise to a kind of determinism. And if we are all determined, then we don't have freedom and we don't have moral responsibility. And then that line of argument leads us to set morality entirely aside. So morality necessarily presupposes freedom. Okay, so are we free agents? And it seems like, though, if we are going to say the apparent world is subject entirely to cause and effect, that's not going to leave room for freedom and therefore moral agency. But if we are going to nonetheless want to think of ourselves as moral beings, we have to make some room for thinking of the possibility of freedom out there in things in themselves or out there in reality independently of this apparent strict cause and effect type of world. So morality, we will be making a little bit of space for morality in things in itself on the presumption of freedom, even if it doesn't seem apparently so. And then the big three that Kant goes on to argue about God. Can we think of God? And it seems like if we look at the world of appearance, there's not really any room for a God-like being, and that leads lots of people to then reject religion and all of the things that go along with religion. It's not in the world of appearances, but maybe, since we don't know what's really out there in the world in itself, reality in itself, maybe there is a God, and so we can think of the possibility of a God out there. What about an immortal soul? If we take the world of appearances again, it seems like our bodies and our minds are subject to all kinds of corruption and they die, and so there's no realm for possible in the world of appearances for that sort of a conception. On the other hand, if we don't really know the nature of the soul in itself, then we can say possibly there is some room for thinking of the soul as an immortal being. So this discussion as to the positive advantage of the critical principles of pure reason can similarly be developed in regard to the concept of God and of the simple nature of the soul. Even the assumption, we can't rule out the assumption, as made on behalf of the necessary practical employment of my reason of God, freedom, and immortality, it is not permissible unless at the same time speculative reason be deprived of its pretensions to transcendent insight. So if we are going to say maybe there's a God out there, maybe there's an immortal soul, maybe there's freedom and morality potentially out there, the only way we can preserve that is by saying nobody really knows what is out there. If we say that reason can do metaphysics in some sort of objective sense and can figure out what really is out there, that's going to be a threat. And it's going to eliminate the possibility of that, because it's going to subject everything to those principles of reason and argumentation and logic and cause and effect and so on, and those possibilities will be eliminated. And now Kant's big rhetorical conclusion. If we are going to preserve any sort of faith in God, and with it, belief in an immortal soul, and moral responsibility, that is to say, if we are going to have religion possible in philosophy, then we have to adopt Kant's critical approach. I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. If we go down the traditional road, then that is going to lead us to become atheistic, materialistic, deterministic, and so forth. But if we can put a limit to what those sorts of metaphysics can do by means of reason, then by putting those severe limits on what reason can do and say reality as it really is in itself is off limits, that's going to leave open the door for some thinking and a faithful adoption of a religious output, a God-oriented output, an immortal soul-oriented output. Carrying on here, the dogmatism of metaphysics, that is the preconception that it is possible to make headway in metaphysics without a previous criticism of pure reason, is the source of all that unbelief, always very dogmatic, which wars against morality. So it's the metaphysicians who think that they can prove materialism, can prove cause and effect, and so forth, and that we can't prove the existence of God. All of those now what Kant wants to call pretensions of the metaphysicians are the source of unbelief. And so if we want to reject unbelief and preserve some sense of morality and religion, we have to take away that pretension, and that therefore is to say Kant's critique is a great friend of religion. All right, next, moving along. But above all, there is the inestimable benefit that all objections to morality and religion will be forever silenced, and this in Socratic fashion, namely by the clearest proof of the ignorance of the objectors. So the objectors are going to be people who want to say, there is no God, can't prove the existence of a God that's out there in the real world. Kant then says, plug in my critique of pure reason. What you can then say to those objectors with respect to their proof of what's really out there, nobody really knows what is out there. And so therefore it's legitimate for us to take a possible faithful attitude with respect to it. The objectors to religion, the objectors to morality are ignorant on Kant's critique. It is therefore the first and most important task of philosophy to deprive metaphysics once and for all of its injurious influence by attacking its errors at the very source. And so that then is to say all of the various schools of metaphysics that have presumed to have a monopoly on doing a certain kind of knowledge, that they are special, that they have special insight into the ultimate nature of reality, that the common run of folk do not. Kant is puncturing that balloon and saying, everybody is in the same world of appearances, and that you speculative metaphysicians rather do not have any special insight into the nature of reality. Your monopoly on knowledge is taken away. Everyone is at the same level. Notwithstanding this important change in the field of the sciences and the loss of its fancied possessions, which speculative reason must suffer, general human interests remain in the same privileged position as hitherto, and the advantages which the world has hitherto derived from the teachings of pure reason are in no way diminished. The loss affects only the monopoly of the schools, in no respect the interests of humanity. So there's a kind of cognitive leveling that goes on here. Everybody is in the same world of appearances. Everyone has the same constituting faculties. Everybody has the same potential range of knowledge of that world of appearances. There is no possibility of metaphysics getting beyond that. And so all of the schools of metaphysics that are going to be a threat to morality, the immortality of the soul, and so on can be set aside. So again, a repetition of these important values: the hope of a future life, the consciousness of freedom, the belief in a wise and great author of the world. When the schools have been brought to recognize that they can lay no claim to higher and fuller insight in a matter of universal human concern than that which is equally within the reach of the great mass of men. All right, so the great mass of men want to have and are capable of having a belief, a consciousness of freedom, or belief in God, consciousness of freedom, and hope of a future life. Those beliefs cannot be attacked by reason-based metaphysics. Reason is off limits when it comes to those subject matters. The arrogant pretensions of the schools set them all aside. So materialism, fatalism, atheism, free thinking, fanaticism, and superstition, which can be injuriously universally, as well as idealism and skepticism. All of those schools of metaphysics based on rational attempts are going to be destroyed, their monopoly pretensions punctured, and room for faith based on the severe limitations of reason to the world of appearances. That's Kant's critique of pure reason. Second premise, summary of the main conclusions.